The woman everyone called heartless was about to trust the only man she had already dismissed, and before the sun set over the Montana mountains, an entire airport would learn that dignity is often dressed in worn work boots. The wind swept across Gallatin Field just outside Bozeman, carrying the sharp scent of jet fuel, melting snow, and pine drifting down from the nearby hills. A sleek silver business jet rolled slowly toward a private hangar where a faded pickup truck sat beside a weathered toolbox that had clearly seen better days. Caleb Monroe wiped his hands on an old shop towel before stepping toward the aircraft with the calm confidence of a man who never wasted movement. At 35, he looked more like someone who belonged in a recruiting poster than beneath fluorescent hangar lights, his square jaw shadowed by a day's stubble, dark brown hair brushed back by the cold breeze, broad shoulders hidden beneath a faded work jacket stained with hydraulic fluid. Across the hangar, his 8-year-old daughter, Ava, sat quietly at a folding table finishing her homework while sipping hot chocolate from a paper cup, occasionally looking up with the patient smile of a little girl who had spent years waiting for her father to finish one more job. The jet's cabin door opened, and Natalie Hawthorne stepped onto the portable stairs without hesitation. At 29, the billionaire CEO carried herself with effortless composure. Her tailored camel coat rested perfectly over a cream-colored dress, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light as if it belonged on a magazine cover instead of a windswept Montana runway. She glanced toward Caleb only briefly before checking another message flashing across her phone. Every second mattered. Somewhere in Seattle, an emergency board meeting threatened the future of the aerospace company she had spent years rebuilding after her father's death. Caleb finished tightening the final inspection panel before stepping back. "You're good to go," he said evenly. "But I'd like to schedule a deeper inspection on one pressure sensor before your next long flight. It isn't dangerous today, but it deserves attention." Natalie looked up, clearly hearing him, yet another call interrupted before she could answer. Her chief legal officer hurried down the stairs. "Miss Hawthorne, they're waiting on the video conference now." She nodded once, gave Caleb an absent-minded smile that barely lasted a second, then climbed back into the cabin as the engines slowly awakened. The aircraft taxied away before anyone mentioned paperwork, payment, or signatures. Silence settled across the hangar until the office manager folded his arms and laughed. "Well, Caleb, looks like the billionaire just got herself a free repair." A mechanic nearby chuckled. "Guess honest people always finish last." Another shook his head. "You really thought someone like her would remember a guy working out of an old hangar?" Caleb simply watched the jet disappear into the pale Montana sky. He showed no anger, no frustration, only the quiet expression of someone measuring something far more important than money. Ava walked over carrying her backpack and slipped her small hand into his. "Dad?" she asked softly. "Is she coming back?" Caleb looked toward the shrinking silver dot above the mountains before answering with the same steady voice that had carried him through every hardship life had placed before him. "Sometimes people leave because they're busy," he said. "Sometimes they leave because they forget. Either way, kindness isn't something you invoice." He turned toward the hangar, ready to clean his tools, unaware that within the next hour the same woman who had flown away without paying would discover that every pilot, every executive, every engineer on board her jet had overlooked the one problem only a forgotten single father could see. The hangar grew quiet after the afternoon traffic faded, leaving only the gentle hum of heaters fighting the Montana chill and the distant sound of another aircraft climbing toward the western sky. Caleb Monroe returned each wrench to its exact place before closing the worn metal toolbox that had belonged to his father decades earlier. He believed tools deserved respect because they remembered every honest day's work. Ava finished her math assignment, packed her notebooks carefully, and walked beside him without needing to ask whether they would stop for dinner on the way home. She already knew the answer. Fridays meant homemade soup because every dollar saved today became another dollar for tomorrow. As they stepped outside, the office manager called after him with another amused grin. "Still think that famous executive will send your payment?" Caleb simply smiled. "People are more than their busiest moment." The manager shook his head as if kindness were a luxury no working man could afford. Caleb never argued. He had learned years ago that pride often made more noise than truth. His old pickup rolled slowly through snow-dusted streets toward a modest white farmhouse sitting just beyond the edge of Bozeman. The porch light flickered to life before sunset, and Ava hurried inside to feed their aging golden retriever while Caleb carried groceries from the truck. The refrigerator held little beyond milk, eggs, vegetables, and leftovers, yet the small kitchen felt warm because laughter had never depended on expensive things. While soup simmered quietly on the stove, Ava looked across the table. "Dad, were you always fixing airplanes?" Caleb stirred the pot before answering. "Not always. I used to help design systems that kept them flying safely." She tilted her head with innocent curiosity. "Then why do people only call you a mechanic?" Caleb smiled gently. "Because that is all they need to know today." She accepted the answer without another question. Children sometimes understood silence better than adults. After dinner, Caleb opened his aging laptop to complete maintenance records from the afternoon. One line caught his attention. He enlarged the diagnostic report from the Hawthorne jet and frowned slightly. The fuel pressure readings had drifted again during engine idle. Barely noticeable, easy to dismiss. Yet something about the pattern felt familiar, like hearing one wrong note inside a favorite song. He opened another screen and compared old engineering specifications stored in a private archive he had never deleted. His breathing slowed. The numbers aligned too closely with a rare sensor synchronization issue that almost never appeared outside specialized turbine configurations. Most civilian technicians would never recognize it because the sequence looked harmless until the aircraft reached higher altitude and colder temperatures. Caleb reached for his phone and called the airport operations desk. "This is Caleb Monroe from Hangar 12. I need someone to contact Hawthorne Aerolux Flight 7 immediately." The dispatcher sounded distracted. "Is this about the unpaid invoice?" "No," Caleb answered calmly. "It is about the airplane." There was a brief pause before the dispatcher sighed. "Their crew already checked out. I am sure their own engineers have everything under control." Caleb looked once more at the diagnostic graph glowing across his screen. "I hope they do," he said quietly. "Because if they miss what I am seeing, that flight is going to need help long before it reaches Seattle." Outside, snowflakes drifted gently across the dark Montana sky, while hundreds of miles away the silver jet continued west, carrying people who believed every problem had already been left behind on the runway. Natalie Hawthorne sat quietly beside the oval conference table inside the jet, but her attention drifted far beyond the financial reports glowing across the cabin screens. Outside the windows, the last golden light of the Montana afternoon slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds as the aircraft climbed through 28,000 feet. Around her, attorneys debated contracts, executives argued over projections, and advisors warned that tomorrow's emergency board meeting in Seattle could determine the future of Hawthorne Aerolux. One director leaned forward. "If this acquisition fails, investors will assume we have lost control." Another adjusted his glasses. "The market opens in less than 14 hours. We cannot afford uncertainty." Natalie listened without interrupting. She had spent years building the company into one of the nation's fastest-growing aerospace manufacturers, yet success had come with a price. Every decision was questioned. Every mistake became tomorrow's headline. Every act of kindness was mistaken for weakness. She looked down at her phone and noticed 3 missed calls from an unfamiliar Montana number. Before she could return the call, another message from corporate legal demanded her immediate attention. She silenced the notification and stared through the cabin window instead. For reasons she could not explain, the image of the quiet mechanic standing beside the hangar lingered in her thoughts. He had not argued. He had not chased after payment. He had simply reminded her about an inspection with the calm confidence of someone who cared more about doing the right thing than collecting recognition. "Ms. Hawthorne," her chief financial officer interrupted. "Are you with us?" She nodded gently. "Continue." Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer noticed a small amber advisory light blink once before disappearing. His first officer glanced at the display. "Probably another sensor fluctuation." Daniel nodded. "Everything else looks normal." The engines continued their steady rhythm while the aircraft settled comfortably into cruise altitude. Thousands of feet below, mountains disappeared beneath fresh snow, their silent peaks hidden beneath layers of evening cloud. Back in Bozeman, Caleb Monroe remained seated at his kitchen table, comparing maintenance records for the third time. The numbers refused to leave his mind. He opened another engineering manual that had not been touched in years and traced one diagram with his finger. His expression changed. The pressure readings were not random at all. They matched a cascading synchronization fault first documented during advanced military turbine testing, a failure so uncommon that nearly every civilian maintenance database ignored it. Caleb stood immediately and reached for the telephone again. This time he called the Regional Flight Coordination Center. "Please," he said calmly. "This cannot wait." The controller listened politely before asking, "Are you the aircraft manufacturer?" "No." "Are you part of the operating flight crew?" "No." "Then I cannot interrupt an active flight over an unverified maintenance concern." Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I understand your procedure. But if I am right, that crew is going to see warning signs that make no sense to them." The controller thanked him courteously and ended the call. Silence returned to the farmhouse, except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. Ava looked up from the living room floor where she had been reading a library book. "Dad, is something wrong?" Caleb forced a reassuring smile. "I hope not." Yet deep inside, he felt the quiet weight that only experience could bring. Because sometimes the most dangerous problems were not the loud ones that everyone noticed, but the small forgotten details that only one patient pair of eyes refused to ignore. The cabin lights dimmed automatically as evening settled across the western sky, casting a warm glow over polished wood and quiet conversations that slowly replaced the earlier arguments. Natalie Hawthorne finally closed her laptop and leaned back for the first time since leaving Montana. She rubbed her temples gently, exhausted not from travel, but from carrying the weight of thousands of employees who depended upon every decision she made. Across the aisle, her chief legal officer lowered his voice. "The board believes tomorrow is about the acquisition." Natalie looked toward the window without turning her head. "Tomorrow has never been about the acquisition. It is about whether people still trust this company." Before anyone answered, a soft chime echoed through the cockpit. Captain Daniel Mercer studied the instrument panel. Another amber advisory light flickered for less than 2 seconds before disappearing again. The first officer reviewed the engine readings one more time. Fuel flow remained within normal limits. Oil pressure looked stable. Exhaust temperatures showed nothing unusual. "That is the second time," the first officer said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Log it for maintenance after landing." Neither pilot sounded alarmed. Modern aircraft generated occasional advisories that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Most of them never returned. Hundreds of miles away, Caleb Monroe stood inside his small workshop behind the farmhouse, surrounded by shelves filled with engineering binders that nobody else had opened in years. Dust floated through the yellow light above his workbench while snow tapped gently against the windows. He compared another archived schematic with the maintenance printout from the business jet. His eyes stopped on one sequence of numbers. Then he reached for a notebook and performed the calculations by hand. When he finished, he did not celebrate being right. Instead, he became even quieter. "It is cascading," he whispered to himself. Ava stepped into the doorway wearing oversized wool socks. "Dad." He looked up immediately and smiled. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. You should be getting ready for bed." She studied his face for a moment. "You always say everything is fine when you are worried." Caleb laughed softly because children often notice truths adults overlooked. After kissing her forehead goodnight, he returned to the telephone once again. This time he called Hawthorne Aerolux headquarters directly. After several transfers, an assistant finally answered. "Executive office." Caleb spoke calmly. "My name is Caleb Monroe. I serviced one of your aircraft this afternoon in Bozeman. I urgently need to speak with Ms. Hawthorne or her flight department." The assistant paused. "Is this about billing?" "No, ma'am. It concerns flight safety." More silence followed before another voice joined the line. "Sir, our maintenance division has already cleared the aircraft. If you have an invoice, please email accounting tomorrow." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "This is not about the invoice." "Then I am afraid there is nothing more we can do this evening." The line disconnected. He slowly placed the receiver back into its cradle without frustration or anger. He simply looked toward the framed photograph resting beside his engineering manuals, a faded picture from another life, where he had once stood beside advanced aircraft with engineers who trusted his judgment without question. Outside, The wind carried fresh snow across the empty fields as the business jet continued west through the darkness. Inside the cockpit, the amber advisory light returned once more, lingering just a little longer than before, and for the first time Captain Mercer leaned closer to the display, sensing that the smallest warning sometimes carried the greatest truth. Captain Daniel Mercer adjusted the brightness on the primary engine display and watched the amber advisory illuminate again, this time refusing to disappear for several long seconds. The cockpit grew noticeably quieter. His first officer compared the readings across every available screen. Fuel flow remained nearly normal. Oil pressure held steady. Engine temperatures stayed comfortably within operating limits. Nothing appeared serious enough to explain the persistent warning, yet something about the pattern felt wrong. Daniel picked up the radio and contacted the company's maintenance coordination center. "We are seeing intermittent pressure synchronization advisories on the left fuel management system. All primary indications remain stable. Do you have any recommendations?" A maintenance controller searched the aircraft records before answering. "Negative. We do not see any recurring faults in the aircraft history. Continue monitoring. Advise if additional warnings appear." Daniel thanked him, but neither pilot looked fully convinced. Behind the cockpit door, Natalie noticed the subtle change in the captain's expression as he stepped briefly into the cabin. His smile remained professional, but his eyes carried a quiet seriousness. "Everything all right?" she asked. Daniel answered calmly. "Nothing alarming, Miss Hawthorne. We are reviewing a minor system indication. It is probably a sensor issue." She nodded politely, yet the words from the mechanic in Bozeman suddenly returned to her memory. He had specifically mentioned a pressure sensor. She reached for her phone and searched the missed calls again. The Montana number still sat unanswered on the screen. Before she could return it, another gentle chime echoed from the cockpit. Daniel immediately turned back toward the flight deck. Meanwhile, Caleb Monroe remained awake inside his workshop despite the late hour. Every instinct developed over years of engineering experience refused to let him walk away. He opened one final archive containing technical notes from a classified turbine integration project completed many years earlier. As he compared the diagrams, one sentence immediately caught his attention. Under rare atmospheric conditions, a delayed synchronization fault could trigger false stability readings before rapidly affecting automated fuel balancing logic. Caleb stared at the page without moving. "That is it," he whispered. "That is exactly it." He grabbed the telephone once again and called the Regional Flight Coordination Center. This time his voice remained steady but carried unmistakable urgency. "Please listen carefully. The warning they are seeing is not the actual problem. The system is hiding the real one." The controller hesitated. "Sir, we already spoke earlier." "I know," Caleb replied respectfully. "I am asking you to give the flight crew one message. Tell them not to trust the apparent fuel balance. Have them manually compare both pressure channels before the automation begins correcting the wrong side." Silence filled the line. Finally, the controller asked, "How could you possibly know that?" Caleb answered honestly. "Because I helped design the engineering procedures that solved this exact failure years ago." The controller stopped typing. "You designed them?" "Part of the team," Caleb replied. "Titles do not matter right now. The people on that airplane do." Several seconds passed before the controller made a decision. Company policy discouraged forwarding technical advice from outside sources, yet something about the quiet confidence in Caleb's voice sounded different from panic or speculation. Without another word, the controller forwarded the message to the flight crew. High above the snow-covered mountains, Captain Mercer received the unexpected advisory from ground coordination. He read the note twice, exchanged a puzzled glance with his first officer, and slowly reached toward the manual control panel. "Whoever this Caleb Monroe is," he said quietly, "he knows something nobody else has mentioned. Let us find out why." Captain Daniel Mercer rested his hand on the manual fuel management controls while the cockpit remained filled with the quiet rhythm of engines cutting through the cold night sky. The unexpected message from ground coordination sat on the display in front of him. It contained only a few carefully chosen sentences, yet every word sounded unusually precise. Manually compare both pressure channels before allowing automatic fuel balancing corrections. Daniel looked toward his first officer. "Run the comparison exactly as written." The first officer nodded and began checking the independent pressure readings one by one instead of relying on the summarized display presented by the aircraft computer. Within seconds, his expression changed. Captain, look at this. Channel A and Channel B are disagreeing by almost 4%, but the automation is averaging the numbers together. Daniel leaned closer. That should not be happening. He immediately disconnected the automatic balancing sequence and followed the manual verification procedure. Almost instantly, the fluctuating advisory stopped blinking. The cockpit became remarkably calm again, but both pilots understood how close they had come to trusting information that appeared perfectly normal. Daniel contacted flight coordination once more. Who sent that advisory? The controller answered honestly. A mechanic from Bozeman named Caleb Monroe insisted we pass along his recommendation. Daniel remained silent for several moments before replying. Please connect me with him. Thousands of feet below, Caleb's telephone rang inside the quiet farmhouse. Ava had already fallen asleep on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a library book resting across her lap. Caleb answered softly, so he would not wake her. This is Caleb Monroe. Mr. Monroe, this is Captain Daniel Mercer aboard Hawthorne Flight 7. We followed your recommendation. Caleb closed his eyes with quiet relief. What did you find? The aircraft computer was masking a synchronization disagreement exactly as you described. Caleb walked slowly toward his workshop where the engineering diagrams still covered his workbench. Listen carefully, Captain. Leave the automation disconnected until landing. Monitor each pressure channel independently every 5 minutes. The engines are healthy. The information feeding the balancing logic is what cannot be trusted. Daniel quickly wrote every instruction by hand. How do you know this system so well? Caleb looked at the faded engineering notebook lying open beneath the lamp. Because many years ago our team discovered that computers sometimes become too confident. We designed a manual procedure so pilots would always have a second way to verify what the screens were telling them. Daniel smiled quietly. You may have saved us from a very long night. Caleb answered with complete sincerity. You saved everyone yourself, Captain. You chose to listen. Inside the cabin, Natalie noticed the tension slowly disappear from the flight crew as Daniel stepped out with a calmer expression than before. She rose from her seat. Captain, what changed? Daniel hesitated before answering. A mechanic in Montana recognized something that none of our systems identified correctly. Natalie stared at him in disbelief. The same mechanic who worked on the airplane? Yes, ma'am. She lowered her eyes toward the unanswered calls still displayed on her phone. The memory of his calm voice echoed inside her mind. He had not tried to impress her. He had not demanded payment. He had simply asked for a deeper inspection because he believed it was the right thing to do. For the first time that evening, the successful billionaire executive no longer thought about tomorrow's board meeting or the headlines waiting in Seattle. She thought only about the quiet single father standing alone inside a small Montana hangar, and how the man everyone overlooked had become the one person every life aboard her aircraft now depended upon. The remainder of the flight passed with a different kind of silence, not the uneasy silence of uncertainty, but the steady quiet that follows when experienced people choose patience over panic. Every 5 minutes, Captain Daniel Mercer and his first officer compared the pressure channels by hand exactly as Caleb Monroe had instructed. Each manual check confirmed the same hidden disagreement inside the automated system, and each confirmation strengthened the captain's respect for a man he had never met. Behind the cockpit door, the conversations inside the cabin gradually faded. The executives stopped debating numbers and acquisitions. Even the attorneys lowered their voices as if the aircraft itself had become a reminder that some problems could never be solved by contracts alone. Natalie Hawthorne remained awake, watching the snowy landscape far below disappear beneath the darkness. She replayed every moment from the Montana hangar. She remembered Caleb's calm expression, his careful recommendation for another inspection, and the way he had never once tried to pressure her into making a decision. She suddenly realized something that unsettled her more than the technical problem itself. She had mistaken quiet confidence for ordinary experience simply because it came from a man wearing an oil-stained jacket instead of an expensive suit. She opened her phone again and dialed the Montana number. This time Caleb answered on the first ring. Mr. Monroe, she said softly, this is Natalie Hawthorne. Caleb smiled gently even though she could not see it. I am glad to hear your voice. How is the flight? Better because of you, she replied honestly. I owe you an apology. Caleb looked toward the sleeping form of Ava resting peacefully beneath her blanket. There is no need for that tonight. What matters is that everyone gets home safely. Natalie lowered her eyes. I left without paying you. You left because you had responsibilities, Caleb answered. People make mistakes when life becomes loud. She remained silent for a moment before asking, why did you keep trying to reach us after that? Caleb did not hesitate. Because an invoice can wait. Human lives should never have to. Those words settled into her heart more deeply than she expected. They carried no accusation, no pride, only quiet dignity. Nearly 2 hours later, the business jet descended through light clouds toward Seattle. The manual procedures continued exactly as Caleb had described, and the aircraft responded smoothly from approach to touchdown. As the wheels rolled safely onto the runway, Captain Mercer exhaled the longest breath of the evening before looking at his first officer with a grateful smile. Sometimes the best engineer is the one nobody thinks to ask. The passengers quietly applauded the crew as the aircraft taxied toward the private terminal, but Daniel knew the applause belonged somewhere else. Natalie remained seated after everyone else stood. She stared out the window at the lights reflecting across the rain-soaked pavement and made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She turned toward her chief legal officer. Cancel my first meeting tomorrow morning. He blinked in confusion. The board will not like that. Natalie picked up her coat. Then the board can wait. Where are you going? He asked. She looked back through the cabin one final time before answering with complete certainty. Back to Montana. There is a father and a daughter waiting in a small hangar, and before I discuss the future of my company with anyone else, I intend to thank the man who quietly protected it without asking for anything in return. The first rays of morning sunlight stretched across the snow-covered valleys surrounding Bozeman as Caleb Monroe unlocked the doors to Hangar 12 exactly as he did every weekday. The cold air carried the familiar scent of pine, fresh frost, and aviation fuel while Ava arranged her schoolbooks on the small folding table beside the office window. Nothing about the quiet morning suggested that the previous night's events had changed anything. Caleb swept the hangar floor, inspected a small propeller aircraft scheduled for routine maintenance, and greeted every customer with the same calm smile that had become part of his character long before life became difficult. Around 9 o'clock, several black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly onto the airport property, followed by a company sedan bearing the Hawthorne Aerolux logo. Mechanics from neighboring hangars paused in their work. Pilots looked up from their pre-flight inspections. Even the office manager who had laughed the day before folded his arms with curious surprise. Natalie Hawthorne stepped out first, dressed far more simply than she had been the previous afternoon, carrying no cameras, no reporters, and no public relations team. Behind her walked Captain Daniel Mercer along with 2 senior engineers from Hawthorne Aerolux. Caleb looked up from his toolbox and nodded politely. Good morning. Natalie smiled warmly. Good morning, Mr. Monroe. Before anyone else could speak, Captain Mercer crossed the hangar and extended his hand with unmistakable respect. I wanted to thank you in person. Every passenger reached home safely because you refused to stop caring. Caleb shook his hand gently. You made the decisions that mattered. One of the Hawthorne engineers had remained unusually quiet since arriving. He had been studying Caleb's face with growing curiosity until his eyes suddenly widened. Wait, he whispered almost to himself. Your name is Caleb Monroe? Caleb nodded once. The engineer immediately turned toward Natalie. Do you know who he is? She looked puzzled. A remarkable mechanic. The engineer slowly smiled. He is much more than that. Without waiting for permission, he opened a tablet and searched an archived engineering publication stored inside the company's internal database. A photograph appeared on the screen showing a younger Caleb standing beside an experimental turbine test platform surrounded by aerospace researchers. This project changed redundant fuel synchronization standards across multiple aircraft platforms over a decade ago, the engineer explained quietly. The lead technical paper lists Caleb Monroe as one of the principal systems architects. Silence settled across the hangar. Another engineer looked at Caleb with astonishment. I studied this case during my certification program. Captain Mercer stared at Caleb in disbelief. You never mentioned any of this. Caleb simply shrugged. The work belonged to an entire team. Natalie looked from the photograph back to the man standing in front of her, wearing the same worn jacket and work boots from the day before. If you helped create those procedures, she asked softly, why are you here fixing airplanes in a small Montana hangar? Caleb glanced toward Ava, who was quietly coloring at her table before answering. Because success means different things after life teaches you what really matters. My daughter needed a father more than the industry needed another executive. No one spoke after that. The mechanics who had laughed lowered their eyes. The office manager quietly removed his cap. Even the morning breeze seemed to fade beneath the weight of a simple truth. The greatest person in the hangar had never introduced himself with titles, achievements, or recognition. He had simply chosen kindness every single day, trusting that character would always speak more clearly than reputation ever could. The quiet inside Hangar 12 lingered long after the morning conversation ended. No one seemed eager to break the silence because everyone understood they had just witnessed something far greater than a remarkable engineering achievement. They had witnessed humility. Natalie Hawthorne slowly stepped toward Caleb Monroe and reached into her briefcase. She removed an envelope along with a company check that covered the unpaid invoice many times over. Caleb glanced at it, but did not reach for either one. Natalie smiled gently. This is not charity. It is payment, gratitude, and an apology that should have come yesterday. Caleb accepted the envelope with both hands, not because of the amount inside, but because he recognized the sincerity behind it. Thank you, he said quietly. I appreciate your honesty more than anything written on paper. Natalie looked around the hangar before speaking again. Yesterday, I believe leadership meant moving faster than everyone else. You reminded me that real leadership begins by slowing down long enough to listen. Captain Daniel Mercer nodded in agreement. The safest decision we made on that flight came from the calmest voice we heard all night. Natalie turned back toward Caleb. I have another request. He waited patiently. Hawthorne Aerolux needs someone to lead a new independent flight safety initiative. I want every engineer, every pilot, and every executive in my company to learn the lesson you taught us. I would like you to direct it. Several employees exchanged surprised glances. For many people, such an offer would have sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. Caleb remained thoughtful for several moments before answering. I cannot leave Montana. Ava still needs her father every afternoon after school. Natalie looked toward the little girl, who smiled shyly while holding her favorite coloring book against her chest. Natalie smiled back. Then we will build the program here. Our people can come to you. Caleb looked down at Ava. What do you think? Ava grinned. If it helps people get home to their families, Mom would probably say yes. Caleb's eyes softened as he remembered the woman they both missed every single day. He nodded once. Then I will help, but only under one condition. Natalie listened carefully. Every new employee who joins your company spends one full day in a maintenance hangar before they ever enter an executive office. They should understand that every safe flight begins with people whose names passengers may never know. Natalie extended her hand. Agreed. They shook hands without photographers, applause, or celebration. It was simply an honest agreement between two people who had learned something valuable from each other. Weeks later, pilots, engineers, executives, and interns began arriving in Bozeman to study Caleb's quiet approach to safety, responsibility, and respect. They expected lectures about technology, but instead found lessons about patience, listening, and character. The old hangar remained unchanged. The coffee was still simple. The toolbox was still worn. Ava still finished her homework beside the office window every afternoon. Yet something invisible had transformed. The place where one forgotten single father had quietly repaired airplanes became known throughout the company as the room where pride ended and wisdom began. And every time another aircraft lifted into the wide Montana sky, Caleb would pause for only a moment before returning to his work, never searching for recognition, because he had already discovered the greatest reward life could offer. It was never found in wealth, titles, or applause. It was found in knowing that kindness given without expectation could travel farther than any airplane and return home carrying hope, dignity, and the precious gift of second chances.